Good day everyone, Grumbles here with another DCS video. It's been a while since the last video. I took it a bit slow the last weeks, but now I'm back in action, and to start things off I want to make a video giving a bit of an overview on the Bf-109 K-4 in DCS. I already took a look at the Fokker 490D9 and the B-51D, also some time before that, but the 109 was still missing. Now, a friend of mine just got the World War II planes available at the moment in DCS, and since I have not flown the 109 in DCS that much myself, we decided to do a few training sessions in the plane to learn it and prepare for the Spitfire in France 1944 map release, which is hopefully in the not too distant future. And that also seems like a good opportunity to make a video about the Bf-109 with some footage from our training sessions. Training, takeoff, landing, and of course some hopefully entertaining air combat as well. So, let's go over the Bf-109, some basic history and data, and then I take a closer look at one of our training fights in it. Well, the Bf-109. This plane was always among my favorites when it comes to World War II fighters, and while I recognize the Fokker 490 as a great fighter plane, I personally always preferred the Bf-109 over it, as it is just amazingly well suited for my preferred fighting style in gunfighters, which is energy fighting as well as maneuvering as much as possible in the vertical. I enjoy doing this immensely. I do have to say though that fighting in the vertical in DCS is currently made harder than it should be, because the air-to-air visibility at the moment is extremely bad, especially over ground. Something that I hope will be addressed in the upcoming 2.5 version of the game and the graphics improvements that brings with it. But in any case, the lightweight Bf-109 with its ridiculously high power-to-weight ratio simply excels at energy fighting and vertical maneuvering, and I can't wait for the introduction of the Mark 9 Spitfire into the game, not just to fly the Spitfire itself, but also because I love this kind of matchup, the turn fighter, the Spitfire, versus the energy fighter, the Bf-109. That is where you really have to fly the Bf-109 to its strengths, as it can't turn with a Spitfire. Now at the moment the Bf-109K is among the best turners among the planes we have in DCS at the moment, with the Mustang being very close to it. Which one of the two has the edge when it comes to turning depends a lot on the fuel state of the two planes, especially on the Mustang's fuel state. With its large fuel tanks that makes a big difference for the B-51, as for most US planes as a matter of fact, as they are usually built for long range with large fuel tanks. At the exact same fuel amount, the Mustang, with its larger wing, has a lower wing loading than the Bf-109 by a decent amount, despite the Bf-109's much lighter overall weight. But the Mustang has a thinner wing profile, and the Bf-109 has automatic leading edge slats, allowing the Bf-109 a higher angle of attack. And with a full fuel tank, the Bf-109 carries just 296 kg of fuel, the Mustang 732 kg. So, say 200 kg of fuel is close to 70% of the total fuel load of the Bf-109K, but less than 30% of the Mustang's full tank. In reality, the Mustang usually would have more fuel than the Bf-109 when they met, as they usually had a longer way back home, and they needed the fuel. But in any case, the Bf-109 K-4 and B-51 are pretty close to each other when it comes to a simple turning contest. Depending on the situation, either one can have the upper hand, but they are usually close enough that the pilot will be the deciding factor in a turning contest. Versus the Spitfire and also the upcoming B-40F, this will be different. Here the Bf-109K will be at a clear disadvantage in a turning contest and needs to use its ability as an energy fighter and its ability in maneuvering in the vertical well to win. But we will talk more about that when we go over the plane's strong and weak points a bit more. Now, some basic history of the plane first, which makes some of the reasons for such strong and weak points more clear. The Bf-109 was of course developed in the mid-30s and entered service in 1937, making it one of the earliest modern stressed skin monoplane fighters to enter service, and very advanced for its time. The fighter was developed by Willy Messerschmitt and his company, which was at the time not called Messerschmitt by the way, but Bayerische Flugzeugwerke, BFW for short, which is why the plane and other Messerschmitt designs of the time are designated BF. Later the company was renamed again back to Messerschmitt, so later designs like the Me 410 were designated Me or ME again. The Bf-109 was designed for high speed and low weight, lightweight designs being a specialty and a passion of Messerschmitt, and while the plane of course got heavier over time, as stronger engines were installed and the airframe was reinforced to take the heavier engines and speeds, the planes stayed among the lightest in service in comparison with other contemporary designs. This, in combination with a very powerful engine, leads to a very good power-to-weight ratio. It makes the Bf-109 great in energy fighting and maneuvering in the vertical. The K-4 we have in DCS has the DB605DB engine, with a maximum power output of about 1850 horsepower with MW50 injection at 1.8 attar manifold pressure. There was also a 605DC, which could get up to 2000 horsepower at 1.98 attar, but that engine was quite rare, and with the Bf-109's low weight, even 1800 horsepower will lead to a higher power-to-weight ratio than pretty much anything else flying at the time, with just very few exceptions. Now, the 605DB has a somewhat higher critical altitude than the earlier A model, so it can keep its power up at slightly higher altitude, though not much more than the ASM. But it's still a single-stage supercharger on this engine, so it won't be able to keep power up at the same altitude than multi-stage designs. On the upside though, the Bf-109's automatic gearbox with its fluid clutch for its supercharger means it can keep its power output consistent till it reaches its critical altitude, without gaps at certain altitudes like you have at multi-stage designs. Now, the Bf-109 does have a pretty small wing, again to keep the weight down as well as drag to make the plane faster, so the Bf-109 does have a pretty high wing loading for a plane of its low weight. So it is not what you would usually consider a turn fighter, though that depends on the position of course, and the exact type of the Bf-109 we are talking about. Now, in the vertical however, the Bf-109 can beat almost everything if flown correctly. However, the lightweight design and the fact that the Bf-109 by the time the K entered service was a very old design in general had some downsides too, of course. Specifically, the plane does not handle high speeds too well. The Bf-109K at the end of World War II was flying at speeds that were not envisioned back in 1937 for this plane. That does not mean that the plane is slow. The Bf-109K is a very fast plane in a straight line at and below critical altitude, but the controls of this lightweight fighter lock up quite badly at high speeds. The faster you are, the more difficult it gets to keep the plane from rolling, and in a dive you have to be careful and keep in mind that you will need some space to recover at high speeds. This control lockup limits your maximum diving speed. On the other hand, you don't have to worry about pulling too hard on the stick at high speed, overstress the airframe and lose a wing. At high speeds you won't have enough control authority left to pull hard enough to do that. Of course, if you also can't pull hard enough to keep from crashing into the ground, that doesn't help too much, so you need to keep your speed in check in a dive. This is something that an opponent can use, of course. A B-51 will dive a lot better and can escape from a Bf-109 that way, as the Bf-109 will either have to pull up earlier or risk flying straight into the ground as it gets too fast. And the sturdier and heavier B-51 will also be more maneuverable in a high-speed dive. The same will most likely be true for P-40F as well, which we get in DCS, which is otherwise of course outmatched by a Bf-109K or all the other World War II fighters we have in the game at the moment. That is the reason why, if you can, you might want to fight a Mustang at lower altitude, as it takes one of its main advantages, its superiority in a high-speed dive, away from it, while you can still pull up into the vertical and maneuver there and use your power-to-weight ratio to get the upper hand. Now, compared with the Focke-Wulf 490D9, you will notice that the Bf-109 needs more control input to keep it stable in general, as you would expect from this much lighter and earlier plane. The Focke-Wulf 490, with its extremely well-balanced controls, is much more comfortable to fly, which is among other things what it was designed for, and it can keep its maneuverability up at high speeds, which the Bf-109 cannot. Having said that, while the 109 needs more work from the pilot to stay stable and doesn't like high-speed dives too much, at lower speed it is very maneuverable when handled right, and its maneuverability in the vertical is pretty much unmatched among World War II fighters, as I already mentioned. Now, for armament, the Bf-109 got two 13mm machine guns in the nose firing through the propeller. Those guns are electrically primed, which helps to keep up a good rate of fire while firing through the propeller. The electrical primer can react a lot faster to propeller blades in front of the gun than a mechanical interrupter can, and therefore you can keep the amount of time the gun holds fire to a minimum. On top of the two machine guns we have a 30mm Mk108 cannon firing through the propeller hub. The cannon was primarily designed to engage larger bombers, but is also effective versus fighters, and only needs one or two hits to take out an enemy fighter. but it has a low rate of fire and muzzle velocity, so you want to be somewhat close when you use it if possible, though not too close. For external ordnance, we can carry 250 and 500 kg bombs on the Bf-109, which can be dropped with either a delay fuse or an instantaneous one. The Werfergranate 21 rockets are available on the Focke-Wulf 90 by now, but not yet on the K-4. I assume they will be integrated on the K-4 as well though, because they are already in the game. Well, that's a bit of an overview of the plane's capabilities. Let's take a look at it in action a bit more, starting with getting it in the air and then back on the ground again. As with the Focke-Wulf 90 I will talk a little bit about the plane's ground handling, takeoff and landing. Nothing tutorial-like, just a quick overview. Now, on more modern planes I usually don't talk much about this part, as it is not a very big deal on more modern tricycle type landing gear planes, but on those old taildragger warbirds it is. That is something I certainly learned in DCS with its accurate portrayal of the planes. The huge difference this makes if you have a more modern tricycle plane or an old taildragger. Now, startup on the World War II planes is usually pretty simple and fast. The Bf-109 starts off pretty much the same as the Focke-Wulf 90. Turn on the circuit breakers, fuel pumps, magnetos, and you're pretty much ready to go. The main difference is that the Bf-109 K-4 does need the ground crew to manually crank the inertial starter, which on the Focke-Wulf 90 D9 works electrically. But there's nothing complicated about the startup, so that once you have done it once, you can generally do it always without needing a checklist or anything. Though if you have taken a longer break, you might want to use one anyway, so you don't forget something small but important like the prop governor. Now, ground handling of the Bf-109 isn't anything special for World War II fighter standards either. You use the brakes to steer, unlock the tail wheel in tight turns and lock it when you want to go straight or it's going to be very unstable. And as usual for taildraggers, you can't see anything out in front on the ground, so you better make sure the way is clear beforehand. The Bf-109, in comparison with the Focke-Wulf 90 and B-51, of course has a very narrow track landing gear, which will also be the case on the Spitfire by the way, so you want to keep your speed slow when you go into turns, as the plane can easily flip over and hit the ground with a wing if you're not careful and go into a corner too fast. But as long as you do that, there is no problem. Now, when you reach the runway though, things get interesting. Takeoff in World War II warbirds, especially a superlight one with a very powerful engine, is something different than a flanker or a F-15. And if you're new to it, will take some time to get it right. It's one of those things me and my buddy have trained the most in our training sessions. The problem is of course that the powerful engine and the propeller in front create a lot of torque, which is especially noticeable on a plane as light as the Bf-109. This torque you have to counter on takeoff. The thing is that unlike how it is portrayed in some other simulators, your rudder simply won't be effective at slow speeds as you start to roll. There isn't enough airflow over the Bf-109's rudder. It will do nothing until you reach a certain speed. You have to keep the plane straight with the brakes at first. While doing so, you have to be careful that you don't make too large corrections, because if you do, the Bf-109 with its narrow track gear will flip over and the wing will hit the ground. The Focke-Wulf 90 with its wider track won't do that. It will ground loop instead though. And you want to find the right time when the rudder has enough airflow to work to drop the nose and switch from using the brakes to using the rudder to keep the plane straight. That is something you can read in a lot of Bf-109 pilot interviews, like the interviews of Finnish Bf-109 pilots that were posted on Hogget some time ago. The pilots in those often talk about how you can feel in the rudder pedals the moment where the rudder is getting effective. In the sim, you don't get that of course, so you just have to learn the right moment, and use the instruments to notice turn and slip in time, so you don't make too large corrections after reacting too late, because if you do, you often only have the choice between taking off in the grass or flip the plane on its side. Now, don't get me wrong, it is all perfectly doable, but you will need a bit of training to consistently do good takeoffs. In the end, everybody has his own favorite takeoff procedure. The way I like to do it is with flaps at 15 degrees down, to get it in the air fast, and 1.4 at the throttle. Speed up while using the brakes to stay straight, till I am on the speed at which I can switch to the rudder, and then get the tail up and eventually the plane in the air. Well, and what goes up has to come back down. So, let's talk about the landing. Now, I find that the landing is easier to learn than the takeoff, as you don't have to fight the torque that much, but still, you have to get it somewhat right if you don't want to crash. The main thing is that you want to make a 3-point landing, if at all possible, in a tail dragger, because if you don't and you set down with the main gear first with any kind of descent rate, the downward momentum will slam the tail down, increasing your angle of attack and making you jump back in the air quite a bit, which very often ends in a fatal crash. If you have the space, you can in theory come in at high speed and touch down with 2 wheels with no descent rate and just roll out from there, but that isn't very pretty and again needs much space. I usually approach at about 200 kph or a little less and then flare to get in a 3-point landing position, killing my descent rate as well as reducing speed, and after touchdown use the brakes to keep it straight for a bit, again careful with large corrections as they easily flip the plane. Also, make sure your tail wheel is locked before landing, or the plane will be extremely unstable after touchdown and hard to keep straight. Well, let's also go over one of our training fights, so we got some action and also to point out a few things. Well, since we are both training the Bf-109 in this case, this is a mirror matchup, which I generally don't like that much, but for training it's sometimes nice and something different every now and then. Usually, a large part of the duels in the air is to know your plane's strong and weak points, and as much as possible your opponent's plane's strong and weak points, and fly in a way to maximize your own strong points and exploit the enemy's weak points. With the same plane, this is not a factor, of course, so we'll have a rather straightforward dogfight, but of course flying energy efficient and slowly getting the upper hand is very important in such a mirror matchup as well. Especially when flying versus a good opponent, which my buddy is, even though he is new to DCS. Now for my personal flying style in these kind of matchups, or in general in World War II fighters, now the longer I play sims, the more I get away from doing any kind of horizontal turns if I can help it. Especially on the defensive I prefer barrel rolls and rolling scissors or a variation of it over flat turns, and we will see an example for this. Now, one thing to mention here, a barrel roll you fly in, for example a rolling scissor, is basically a constant turn, with some roll rate added to it to constantly change the direction of the turn. This means that the turn rate is a deciding factor here in rolling scissors, more so than the roll rate, despite the fact that it is called rolling scissors. In flat scissors, on the other hand, where you turn in one direction, then use your superior roll rate to quickly change direction and turn in the other way, roll rate is much more important. Well, just a few things I wanted to mention first. Well, let's take a look at one of our training fights. We started our fights from different random positions to get a feel for different situations, and this just happens to be the starting point for this one. Both in a turn canopy to canopy more or less as we start. So at first, to get a feel for things, we turn a few circles semi-horizontal to see where things go in this engagement, alternating between pointing the nose down to gain speed and then pulling up and turn into the opponent in a tighter turn using the speed built up earlier to come around faster, trying to slowly get the advantage and eventually a shot on the opponent, preferably before he gets a shot at you. Now, this of course costs altitude, and since we started pretty low to begin with, we soon reach the ground where you can no longer easily use altitude to regain speed, so the fight flattens out a bit. Not having the opportunity for either side to easily regain speed in a dive can be a good thing for Bf-109 with its good power to weight ratio, as it can keep its energy up well, but of course here we are both Bf-109s, and here I see an opportunity to get this fight into the kind of barrel roll rolling scissors fights I prefer. This is quite typical for my preferred style of World War II fighters, so as we merged again I changed direction, and instead of keeping up the turn I went up in a barrel roll and came back down as my opponent turned back into me. Though I also get a bit slow, so I do have to fight the plane a bit in the turn to keep it stable as I turn back after my opponent, but now I can dive down again, building up some speed. Now, till now I flew with full power and my MW50 injection on, and I was worried at this point that this slowing down while maneuvering I won't have sufficient cooling anymore and the engine will overheat, so I throttled back a bit. Though by now I learned that in this situation the cooling would still have been sufficient to keep full throttle up for a bit longer. I follow my opponent's Bf-109, but then I make a mistake that gets me in a bad situation I want to explain a little bit. Now, my opponent goes up in a vertical and then dives back down. I first try to get a shot at his Bf-109, but can't get in position in time, and as his Bf-109 dives back down, I want to try to slot in behind it as it goes past me. But with me not on full power, I lose speed faster than I thought I would, and looking at the sky I don't realize that in time here, so I stall the plane, while pointing the nose up. Now in this situation it is very important that you throttle back as soon as you realize what's going on. For a few reasons. Now a plane's center of gravity is a bit forward, so that when the plane gets too slow, the nose drops and you get your speed back. However, the 109 is a very lightweight plane with a powerful engine and propeller on the front, which have enough power to keep your nose from dropping back down for a bit in a situation like this. If you don't realize that in time and keep your throttle forward, it can go as far as you falling backwards a bit. Now that is bad for several reasons. First, you can't recover if your nose isn't pointing down and you're speeding up. Second, you will spin around like crazy because of the engine torque and no airflow over the stabilizer to counter it. And last but not least, you don't have any airflow for your cooling system, so your engine will overheat almost instantaneously. That is just something I wanted to show. If you stall with the nose up, throttle back all the way or you're in trouble. Well, I got out of it just in time not to kill the engine or crash, but my buddy got behind me, of course. As mentioned before though, in a situation like this I will generally go for rolling scissors, unless my opponent's plane turns much better than mine. Since you are in a constant turn, but the direction of that turn changes constantly, it's hard for an opponent to get lead, while in a horizontal turn an opponent might be able to do so even if he doesn't have a better turning plane if he has the energy. Also, in this situation it's harder to judge how close you really are and who will end up in front if you merge, meaning you can more easily get an overshoot, which in a horizontal turn is almost impossible as it is 100% clear how far away your target is. However, you don't want nice and even rolls and maneuvers. Forget about those fancy drawings you find on Google Picture Search when you look for things like rolling scissors, and the nice and even symmetrical drawings there. That is not what you want, as it would be much too predictable and easy to counter. You want to constantly mix things up to keep your enemy from getting an easy shot. Keep an eye on your opponent's plane and, for example, increase roll rate and tighten your turn just in the right moment when you feel he might be able to get a shot. Change direction if it benefits you during a merge and things like that. I generally try to pull up hard in a barrel roll when I get the opportunity to do so, to trade speed for altitude and draw an opponent in closer. And as I dive back down, turn into the opponent's flight path, all aimed to eventually be able to roll around the opponent and slot in behind him. But as mentioned, a lot of that depends on the ability of the planes involved, and of course you don't want an opponent to be too far away when you start doing this, otherwise you would be an easy target. Versus a Spitfire with its superior turn right and ability to fly very slowly, this kind of approach might not work as well either, but would only be a last-ditch maneuver anyway, as versus a Spitfire you would want to fight in the vertical using your power-to-weight ratio for all it is worth anyway. Well, that was a look at one of our training fights. I thought it was an entertaining one, and this is it for this look at the Bf-109K in DCS. As expected, I like the plane a lot. I do hope we will soon see the Spitfire and the 2.5 update, which I hope solves a few of the visibility problems we currently have, as Spitfire vs Bf-109 matchups are among my favorites. But this is it for this video. As always, I hope it was enjoyable, thanks for watching, and maybe I'll see you next time.